Good evening. I am Jean Marie Proschitz, Executive Director of the Salem Athenaeum. I'm coming to you from the Athenaeum Reading Room, where we hope to see you all again soon in the near future. In the meantime, we are delighted to have you join us online. Please visit our website or social media pages to learn about other upcoming programs, group meetings, and a concert with the Boston Classical Trio that was filmed here in the Reading Room and will be broadcast in mid-March. Recordings of past programs may be found on our YouTube channel linked from the website. None of these programs would be possible without your generous support and that of our program sponsors, Salem 5 Bank, Susie Insurance, and Rachel and Rob Lutz. Thank you for joining us for the first program in a new series, where we will create opportunities for education and conversation about reckoning with systemic racism. We encourage you to ask questions of our panelists this evening. To submit your question, use the Q&A function. General comments are welcome in the chat feature. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for tonight's program, Joyce Maroney. Joyce is a retired high-tech marketing executive. She most recently served as the executive director of the Workforce Institute and as a company spokesperson at Ultimate Kronos Group, a global technology firm headquartered in Massachusetts. Joyce serves on the Athenaeum's Cultural Programming Committee and is one of the organizers of tonight's event. Joyce?
Would help if I unmuted myself. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We do want to talk about the long-standing systemic racism in the United States that remains a significant societal problem that continues to limit opportunities for individuals and for our entire country. More and more Americans are entering the battle against racism, and many of us are seeking opportunities to deepen our understanding of its roots and results in order to improve our effectiveness in achieving real and lasting change. At the Salem Athenaeum, we're planning several talks over the course of this year to help us do just that. Tonight is our first talk on this topic, and we'll focus on the part that monuments play in perpetuating racist ideas or ideals. I'm thrilled to be joined by three terrific panelists this evening who are going to help us understand why monuments are important and how we should be thinking about monuments moving forward. Our esteemed panelists this evening are Dr. Kabria Baumgartner. Kabria is Associate Professor of English and American Studies at the University of New Hampshire. She is a historian of 19th century African-American life and culture in the United States and author of the award-winning book, In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women and Educational Activism in Antebellum America. Thank you so much, Kabria, for being with us. Next, we have Dr. Sarah Betham. She is the chair of liberal arts and assistant professor of art history at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She specializes in American art and particularly the monuments erected to citizen soldiers after the Civil War. So thank you so much, Sarah. And rounding out our panel tonight is Dr. Emily Murphy. Some of you may know her. She is a Salemite, and she is the National Park Service Curator and Historian at the Salem Maritime National Site, as well as the Saugus Ironworks site. She is on the St. John's College History Task Force at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. They've been tasked with researching the college's relationship with enslaved people and the African-American community in Annapolis and recommending ways of memorializing this history. So thanks to all of you panelists for joining us this evening. So for our audience, I have a set of prepared questions, but also want to make sure that we get to your questions during the talk this evening. So if you have questions as we're chatting, please submit them via the Q&A. I'm going to pause at around 10 minutes of 8, and we will take audience questions at that time if there are any. But in any case, let's get started. So my first question, and one that I'm going to pose to all three panelists, is, why does this conversation about monuments even matter? And I'm going to start with you, Kabria.
I think that this conversation is important because monuments and memorials are about our memories, right? Our memories in the recent past, but also the memories of our ancestors in the distant past, and what that means in the present and what that means for our future. So we draw meaning from public memorials and monuments based on what we see and based on what it represents and how it makes us feel and really what it makes us think. And so this is an important conversation in part because we've had so many controversies surrounding the monuments and memorials in the United States.
Thanks, Kabria. Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I think that the events of the past, 6 months especially, but the past really 5 years in addition, where the conversation about monuments was really ramped up, has proven just how vital this conversation is, that people are willing to demonstrate about it, that people are willing to gather and make their voices known, that people are so angry about these monuments that they're willing to tear them down. Just goes to show how much this means to people. This has been a conversation that has been heating up more and more and more over the past couple of years, and all kinds of events have taken place because of them. Some of them very upsetting, some of them very violent events, even up to and including the attacks on the Capitol, where you saw these violent events occurring in front of major American monuments and works of American art. So, this isn't just kind of a sidebar conversation for art historians and professionals to have. It's one that we're all involved in, one that affects every single one of us, that affects our everyday life as we move through our communities, and one that we definitely all have to reckon with. It's right out there in the middle of public space now, and we need to be thinking about how we're going to move forward.
Thank you. And Emily?
I mean, I have to agree with both of the other speakers. I mean, we're really at a moment in time where we are thinking about what values do we want to pass on to the next generations. Where do we want to what do we want to show is American to future generations, and in some cases that's a case of going back and editing what previous generations have done, and I think this is a really important moment in time, and so this is the type of conversation that should be happening in all sorts of different levels of society, and that we should be thinking about. I think we're gonna talk a little bit later about exactly what is a memorial, and that we need to think about what is a memorial, what messages do they send, and whether we've got putting up memorials, we've got tearing down memorials, and what messages are those going to send to future generations.
Thanks, Emily. And actually, yes, our next question, and this is an audience participation question, is what forms do memorials assume? So that is, what are we talking about beyond plaques and statues? So if you have a thought about what you think constitutes a memorial, you can put your thoughts in the chat function. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask a couple of our panelists to respond to that as well. And actually, I'm going to start with you, Emily.
Okay.
So what constitutes a memorial?
Well, I'm coming from a very regimented world in the Park Service. We actually have a definition of what a commemorative work is, and this is from the National Park Service's management policies, which were written in 2006. I think we're in the process of doing an update, and it says here, the term commemorative work may mean any statue, monument, sculpture, memorial, plaque, or other structure or landscape feature, including a garden or memorial grove, designed to perpetuate in a permanent manner the memory of a person, group, event, or other significant element of history. And that includes the naming of park structures and other features. So that's kind of the rubric that we are following about what we consider to be a memorial structure.
Okay. And Sarah, as an art historian, how would you define the term?
Sure. So of course, the plaques and the statues are the parts that I spend most of my time on, being an art historian. But I think that there's a lot more to it, and there's ever since at least the Civil War, which is the first moment where there's a huge amount of memorialization taking place. That there was always this debate about whether a memorial should be a statue, something that was purpose-built just for that, or whether it should be a useful structure that was also then dedicated to the memory of a certain group of people. They wanted to do this during the Civil War. There's some famous examples. Lexington, Massachusetts, for instance, had their town hall be a memorial in addition to the town hall. But this is something that really took off during World War II. So you have Memorial Stadium, Memorial Hospital. And then I think the other part of it to think about too is that there are so many ways in which all of the places around us contain historical memory in ways that we're not even thinking about it. Why are our streets named the things that they are? Where do the names of high schools come from? And so when you're talking about trying to find all of the places where racism or white supremacy have been baked into the system, you're not just looking at statues, you're also looking at, the place names that you might be using every day as you go about your business.
And I think there's also another, another thing that's sort of a debate is what about something like a recurring event?
Sure.
An annual event. Is that a memorial in terms of the fact that it causes you to remember?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of something specifically like Dawn Salute in Concord that's been happening, for 75, 80 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our audience members asked maybe a memorial could be an event like a Columbus Day parade.
Mm-hmm.
So great minds think alike. Thank you for that. So when we think about, memorials can take different forms. Memorials are there for different reasons that we're going to get into. But who decides who or what to memorialize in the first place? I mean, even here in Salem, there are signs and plaques and statues that we probably walk by every day and have no particular, memory or knowledge of who they're memorializing. So, Kabria, I'm going to pose this first to you because I think this is a really critical part of this conversation.
Right. Yes. I mean, I think what to memorialize publicly should be agreed upon by a diverse community, right? Because public memorials and monuments should reflect the community's interests and the community's values. But that hasn't always been the case historically. We know that too often it's powerful and influential people who are the ones who decide what to memorialize and who to memorialize. And I think one of the examples that comes to mind immediately, and the one that sort of filled in the newspapers, is the Confederate Monument controversy. So one of the stats that I was looking at said, as of 2017, there were approximately 700 Confederate monuments in the United States. Today, there are considerably fewer because some of those monuments have been removed thanks to the activism of protesters. But we have to realize that it was powerful people and organizations that fundraised to build those monuments. And that's part of the history that we can't escape.
Yep. And Emily, so the government has a definition of what constitutes a memorial, but what's your take on who decides?
Well, I think one of the lessons that that you can see in the Park Service is that the majority of the places that we memorialize within the National Park Service up until relatively recently were all things that were agreed upon by the white majority in many cases. So it has not been until relatively recently that the Park Service has brought into the units, sites that specifically are looking at African American history, and Stonewall is a great example with the first LGBTQ site in the Park Service system. So from my perspective, it's whoever has the strength and willpower to push something through Congress is the group that gets to memorialize. And that's been traditionally the way things have been done on a federal and congressional level.
Gotcha. So let's look specifically at Confederate monuments in particular. They have gotten a lot of attention, especially in the last 5-10 years. And what I find most interesting about the Confederate monuments is a lot of them were erected well after the end of the Civil War, and for reasons that went way beyond celebrating military heroes. So what were some of those reasons? I'm going to start with you, Sarah.
Sure. This is kind of my bread and butter. So my research has been on those common soldier monuments that are in every small town, and I've been working on it probably since like maybe 2010. This has been what I've been researching. And of course, like when those monuments were first put up, the whole idea was to memorialize the enormous number of soldiers who died during the Civil War. I think the current estimate is around 750,000. And of those, so many of them, nobody even knew what happened to them. Of the Union soldiers who died, only 50% were ever identified, and the Confederate numbers are way worse than that. And so in the first years after the war, people are putting these monuments up primarily as sites of mourning, where they can go and have somewhere to visit that reminds them of their son or their brother or their father, when they have no idea what actually happened to them. But very quickly in both the North and the South, they start to take on other meanings. They start to move out of the cemeteries and be put into town squares. And then they take on kind of a more civic identity. Around the time that's happening in the South is also the same time where it's the end of Reconstruction, which means the end of a period in American history that was a real revolution for civil rights. This amazing time period when the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, ending slavery, giving citizenship to all men in America, and giving the vote to all men in America, were passed. A moment where for Black Americans that there was a real possibility that things were going to take off and be a lot better. But during that same time period in the South especially, there was a concerted campaign of terrorism to take back every single one of those rights, to squash every bit of hope that existed, and to try to return everything to a state that was even worse than slavery. And that's the point at which that really kind of comes to an end, and where this white Southerners have really won that war, is the point at which these Confederate monuments start to appear. And they're not being put up in cemeteries, they're being put up in town squares, in the county seat of every county in the South, right in front of the county courthouse, which is the center of government, which is the place where all kinds of other racist crimes occur. The whole history of lynching is also connected with those courthouse lawn spaces. And then those monuments then are there claiming those spaces for white supremacy and sending a very, very specific message to Black Southerners that these spaces are not for them. And so I think when people are reacting against Confederate monuments, when people are connecting Confederate monuments with the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality today, they are seeing very clearly that this is what those monuments were for.
Thank you very much. Kabria, your perspective on this.
Yes, I would just echo what Sarah has said. Most Confederate monuments were built between the 1890s and 1950s, a period that we refer to as the Jim Crow era of racial segregation. And there were organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was founded in 1894. And that organization raised money to build these Confederate monuments. And I guess I would add too that these monuments were really impressed upon the landscape, right? And it was a particular ideology that underpinned the building of these monuments, and that was the lost cause, right? And the myth of the lost cause, which basically means some of the ideas that were floated. The U.S. Civil War was righteous. The war was over states' rights and not slavery. And there's also, this idea that enslaved African Americans were loyal to their enslavers, that they were faithful to their enslavers. And so those myths really kind of describe the lost cause. And we know they're not true, right? We know that the Civil War was about slavery. We know that enslaved African Americans resisted slavery in so many ways. We have, a bunch of slave narratives that we can read where we can get a sense of, the diversity of African American resistance, right, under slavery, but also free Blacks in the North who were trying to help their enslaved brothers and sisters. So these Confederate monuments were used to intimidate Black people. And for African Americans, can you imagine these monuments are going up, monuments to Confederate generals who were traitors, holidays, there was Jefferson Davis holidays celebrating the Confederacy. It was really an affront to African Americans. And they tried to resist in the ways that they could. But, this is sort of post-Reconstruction, you also see the rolling back of some of the gains that were made during radical Reconstruction. And so African Americans have a lot that that they're contending with, particularly in the South. I would add that what's interesting to me is sort of going back to some of the texts and some of the literature written in the early 20th century. I was looking at Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, right? And this is where we get the theory of double consciousness, but he also talks about white Southern culture. And there's a great quote that I think really sums up how, what these monuments symbolized. So Du Bois said that there was scarcely a white man in the South who did not honestly regard emancipation as a crime and its practical nullification as a duty. So we can think about the Confederate monuments as part of a larger strategy to rewrite the outcome of the war and also to subjugate Black people all over again, right? As Sarah was saying, hopes to subjugate Black people and to sort of install slavery, but by another name. And I think that's what really makes these monuments so insidious.
Yeah. So Sarah, one thing that Kabria touched on that I wanted to dig in a little deeper with you is the role that women played and have played in fundraising for and getting these monuments installed. And Kabria mentioned the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Actually, one of my colleagues on the Athenaeum team was like, "What's the deal with the women? Why were women so, in particular, so fervent about getting behind this?"
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it is one of those things that's really interesting about Confederate monuments. And I think the way to answer that is to kind of go back and think about the end of the war, where, it's unclear what was going to happen to people who had sided with the Confederacy at the end of the Civil War. It was possible that there could have been mass executions. It was possible that people could have ended up being, incarcerated because of their role in the Confederacy. And what ended up happening was, not that. The goal was to try to reassimilate Confederates back into the United States. But one of the things that any man who had been part of the Confederacy had to do to retain citizenship, to be able to vote, to be able to get his rights back, was to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. But women can't hold property, women can't vote, women can't do any of those things. So women don't have to swear the oath. Women aren't worried about trying to protect their citizenship rights because they don't have any. And also, if you think about what kind of the first monuments are all about, that they're all about mourning, that they're all about, oh, we're not trying to perpetuate racism. We're not trying to perpetuate the lost cause. We're just taking these flowers and sticking the flowers on on our brother's grave. We're not doing anything here. This is just women's stuff. And so that's kind of the idea, that the whole, lost cause ideology is kind of smuggled in by women, because women aren't taken seriously as political actors. And so they're able to become extremely powerful, and to really participate in politics by, just denying that that's what they're doing. This starts earlier than the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It actually starts pretty much right after the war with these groups called Ladies Memorial Associations, which tend to be made up of the elite women in any particular social group. They often don't actually have relatives who fought for the Confederacy. So they're not the wives of the rank and file soldiers. They are, the wives of the planters and the daughters of the planters, who were the ones who were forming these organizations and then perpetuating this ideology through this kind of cloak of Victorian womanhood. And once they start getting that power, they kind of really enjoy it, and they hold on to it. Which then kind of leads up eventually to the founding of the Daughters. Right before that, there is the Richmond Robert E. Lee Monument, which you see a picture of behind me there. When that goes up, there's actually a big kind of conflict between a group of male veterans and a women's group who's also working on it. And I think that's partly because of that conflict that then the Daughters are founded. Overall, the idea is that they're able to do this because they're able to deny that it's actually political.
And is the implication that men are pulling strings behind the scenes, or this movement just sort of, it got underway and then we're like, hey, this works for us?
I think, the men's organizations are always there, but they actually don't end up being as powerful or as successful as the women's organizations. They're never able to take back the control of the monument building. They're never able to they're not as successful in raising money as the women's organizations are. So, it's one of those things that's kind of, there's a weird sort of feminism going on here, but on the other hand, these women then turn around and then oppose, say, suffrage for women, for instance. They were all very much against that. So there's a real conservatism there as well, and also kind of an enjoyment of the kind of protections that sort of Southern womanhood would have, and Southern white womanhood.
Thank you.
Although this is, one of the things that has kind of complicated the current memorialization of the women's suffrage movement, because there were a number of women who were involved in both. And some of the real power players in terms of women's suffrage in the South, and some of the compromises that were made by the women's suffrage movement have really complicated our ability to memorialize some of these people.
Sure.
So let's take a step back from Confederate memorials in particular and ask the broader question about what makes a memorial racist or otherwise inappropriate. Because different images have different impacts on different people and different groups of people. So what should make us step back and say, wait a minute, why are we celebrating this on the Times Square? And maybe we should think about getting rid of it. And I'm going to pose this question to you, Sarah first.
Okay. So I would say, what makes a memorial inappropriate? I think that in general, my feeling across the board is that local communities should have as much right as possible to decide for themselves what is in their public spaces. And that if people in a community decide that they don't want something to be there anymore, then they should be able to take it down. Certainly, like, this starts with Confederate monuments. Obviously, those monuments are racist and violent. Monuments to Columbus, also obviously racist and violent. But I think that one of the things that we kind of saw happening over the summer is that it's a little bit more complicated than that. that are a lot more complicated than that there is a great deal of things going on in our American history that really need to be unpacked. The Indigenous community has really come forward and pointed out, that, for instance, a lot of the Union generals of the Civil War, after the war was over, did absolutely horrific things in the context of the Indian Wars. There are a couple of monuments out west that were taken down this summer that were Union monuments, where they had listed both the engagements that the regiment had been in during the Civil War, but then also the engagements they'd been involved in the Indian Wars afterwards. And a couple of those have come down. And so, I think that generally understanding that a community should be able to have control over its own space, to decide what things it wants to honor, and decide, there isn't unlimited public space. There's only so many town squares. And so a community should be able to decide what goes in their square. And if they don't want to have something there anymore, they should be able to decide what they want to do with it instead.
And Kabria, you touched on this before, that it should be a community decision, and often, especially historically, it hasn't been. So can you say more about that?
Yes, I think that there are questions that we can ask ourselves about sort of memorials and monuments that exist now, and also maybe, memorials and monuments that we want to build. As I was thinking about this question, I was thinking, what does it look like when we center our greatest ideals, right? Like inclusion and belonging and freedom, right? What will our monuments look like, and what will our memorials look like? So some of the questions that I sort of sketched out, does the memorial distort history? Is the history of a particular person, event, or even value, is it grossly misrepresented? Is the monument or memorial exploitative? Does it advertise a lie? Is it intended to mock or shame? And if it's a memorial to a person, does it dehumanize or oppress? And I think when we ask those questions, right, we have to make sure that there are people in a room, right, at the table who can answer them, and who can answer them honestly and bravely, and that there's a willingness to listen, right, and to hold those truths. And I think in the case of the Confederate monuments, it's clear that they didn't care what African Americans thought about the monuments. They didn't care about celebrating, Jefferson Davis's birthday. Right? The idea was that African Americans were to be oppressed, were to be subjugated, and these monuments were, to really bring about a new narrative, right? A new narrative of the war that basically, honored white supremacy. That was the overall effect of the Confederate monuments and the lost cause ideology. But I think if we ask ourselves these questions about our memorials and our monuments, we could kind of have a more, democratic, small d, democratic view of how we memorialize and what we memorialize.
Thank you. So, Emily, I'm going to ask you next. So what do you do with these memorials when you do decide that they no longer belong, in the community? How do you retire them? What do you do with them? Oop, you're muted.
Nope, I got it. Well, speaking as a curator, this is like one of my biggest nightmares because, just storing these things is a nightmare. So, it on a very practical level, a lot of these things are mass produced. Do we really need to keep an example, every example of every one? And, can we, is it going to help tell a story? I mean, this is the sort of, I'm thinking about sort of bringing things, if you're bringing things into a museum collection, is saving this monument, putting it into a museum collection, is that going to help tell a story that cannot be better told, that can perhaps be better told with other things, with other items. So I think, there's a number of things to weigh in terms of, what happens with these items. I think in some cases we may not really get the chance. We're a lot of these get destroyed as they come down. And so I think if we've got something that's made by a famous artist, maybe you want to keep that to be able to sort of, again, tell a story about this artist and the way that they engaged with this subject. That could, but again, it's not, you're talking about these items are large. They take up a lot of space. They take up a lot of resources. And if it wasn't good enough to be in the public square, is it really good enough to keep in perpetuity?
Well, Sarah, first time I saw you speak, you had a surprising take on the argument for artistic merit for an art historian. So what's your take on what we should do with these, especially the ones that have been deemed as racist or otherwise inappropriate monuments?
Sure. So I think that maybe you're referring to it. I think I probably said something along the lines of that I don't care whether they're good.
Yeah.
So, obviously I wrote my dissertation on the mass-produced monuments that everybody talks about, that there's a million of them that all look the same. And somehow in my sad little heart, I loved them, and I wrote my dissertation about them. So I do have a lot of sympathy for the idea of a community deciding that they want to memorialize their people from their community and only having $500 in 1890s money. And so they bought the mass-produced statue. I have a lot of sympathy for that. And I don't necessarily have a lot of sympathy for somebody who spent $200,000 to memorialize Robert E. Lee. I don't care how good the statue is. I don't care what happens to it. But I will also say that I think that the idea of figuring out what to do with these things next is both a horrible problem, but also one of the most exciting aspects of this, because some people are doing really cool stuff. Everything that Emily said is right. That, as Kabria said, there are 700 of these things. Some of them are enormous. They're like 20 feet tall. You can't put that inside. It will break the floor. There's nowhere to put it. And so, sometimes there are some real practical concerns. There's no way that 700 Confederate monuments, plus all the Christopher Columbuses and whatever else anybody's going to take down, is going to be absorbed by America's museums. Some of these things are going to end up being sold privately, and that has happened. I heard of a Robert E. Lee statue that was sold and is now sitting in a golf course. So some of that is going to happen. But a couple of examples that I could think of are that I think there are plans for the Durham, North Carolina monument that was pulled down in 2017, the one that got crunched, that everybody can probably picture. They're going to put that back on display, crunched. Which is going to be really cool. The Edward Valentine Museum is probably going to end up getting the Jefferson Davis statue that was torn down on Monument Avenue. And they're also planning on displaying that in its current condition, which is all banged up and covered in graffiti. Also, I believe it's the Museum of African American History and Culture. I think that's what the name is in Houston. They also took on a Confederate monument that they've put on the ground inside an enclosure so that you can't see it from the street. It's outdoors, but they've put plywood up all around it so that you can't see it unless you want to. And then they've made it a contemporary artist. It's a bunch of eyeballs on sticks that are all staring at it. So Austin, Texas, they have at UT Austin, they've brought in a Jefferson Davis inside and built this huge display to talk about why the Jefferson Davis was ever put up in the first place. So there are really interesting ideas that curators have come up with for ways to bring these into collections. And I think there's probably a few examples of those that are going to happen. Probably not for all of them. and anything from putting them into cemeteries to keeping them in storage forever. There's always the idea of the kind of Soviet style statue parks that were made with Soviet monuments, which probably won't work quite as well with American monuments, because American monuments are not as silly as some of the Soviet monuments, so they probably won't be as funny. But all of those kind of things will probably be tried. But
And
it's
there
one of those
is
things.
there is one
ahead.
museum in Germany. I think it's in Germany, but there's a couple of museums that have been sort of taking on these types of statues in the European context and doing installations. So you come to the museum and the interpretation there is contextualizing when and how and what happened with these.
Yeah, and there are ways to do that right, I think. And it's certainly controversial, and not everyone's going to feel really good about a museum taking on one of these things. But I feel like a smart curator who's got their heart in the right place. I'm happy to see what they would come up with.
So the next question we were going to ask, and I think unless you guys tell me otherwise, we've already addressed this, was what arguments are made to justify preserving racist monuments? I think we've knocked down some of the arguments. So if you don't mind, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to our next question, okay. We do have an example close to home of a recent monument removal that I think is kind of interesting, and that is the Emancipation statue by Thomas Ball that was removed in just December in response to a public petition by Bostonian Tory Bullock. So this was a statue of Abraham Lincoln, basically with his hand on the head of a kneeling Black man. This monument had a long and controversial history. There is another copy of this monument in Washington, D.C., which is not currently being removed, as I understand it. So I'd like to hear from each of our panelists, actually, why that monument was in Boston in the first place, and what we think is likely to happen next, because now there is a pedestal and a big empty space where this large statue used to be. So Kabria, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Sure. I think maybe Sarah might talk more about the history of how that monument got there. I wanted to, I wanted to throw out an idea, especially, considering what we know about Confederate monuments, right, that were built during the Jim Crow era. They were built to assert the lost cause myth. And, if we know that, then what would it mean now to build powerful, symbolic monuments, right, toward racial justice, especially during this era of Black Lives Matter. I really do think that when we consider what we're going to build, where we're going to build it, we do need to center ideas like inclusion, belonging, and freedom. We need to think about that. How might a monument be inclusive of a community, and how might it be exclusive? And I also want to say that I don't think all of our monuments have to be, about celebrating a person. I mean, certainly that can happen. It can celebrate a person or an event, but we can also pay homage to an idea, right, or a particular value. Or quite frankly, we can talk about the dispossession of Indigenous land, right, and our own culpability and complicity in that today. So there are ways in which we could have really dynamic, really difficult conversations about monuments and memorials, right? Without, we can have those difficult conversations and not repeat the past, right? Not, 100 years from now, have the next generation having to deal with, Confederate monuments or whatever the monuments might be. We can think better about this now. We can be inclusive in ways that maybe we couldn't 100 years ago. And so when you think about that empty space, in one of the op-eds I wrote, I said, there are Black Bostonians who can, we can build statues to them, but we can also build a statue to an idea. And that would be incredible, I think.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, that particular statue, that's one of those ones I feel like if you look at that and you don't know what the problem is, then I don't know what to tell you. I feel that way about that one and about the Theodore Roosevelt statue in front of the Museum of Natural History. I mean, it's fairly obvious what the problem is. A little bit about what the history was. The DC statue was actually the first one, so this is kind of a sister statue to that one. The original idea for it was proposed by a group of formerly enslaved people who had collected some money and wanted to build a statue to Emancipation and to Abraham Lincoln. And an all-white committee kind of took their money and then decided to take over the entire process. And they were going to be the ones to decide who they were going to hire, what the statue was going to look like. It went through lots and lots and lots of permutations. And if anybody's interested in learning more about it, Kirk Savage in his Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves book wrote a whole chapter about it. And it's really terrific and lays the whole thing out. But eventually they ended up selecting Thomas Ball, who was this, an elder statesman of American sculpture, but and one who perpetuated a certain kind of statuary in the earlier part of the 19th century, and who would kind of open up his studio. He was a guy who like trained a lot of the younger sculptors. And so he was an elder statesman that had a lot of respect, but there were certainly younger sculptors who would have come up with a much more interesting idea. But he basically, everything he makes kind of looks like a garbage can on legs, and Abraham Lincoln looks like a garbage can on legs. And he is holding out his hand over this freed slave in a very offensive, upsetting way. Frederick Douglass gave the keynote speech very famously at the DC version of this statue, and kind of subtly roasted it and Lincoln and President Grant, who was sitting in front of him, and everybody in front of him. He clearly was seething with anger the entire time. And what's good enough for Frederick Douglass is good enough for me. And I'm very glad to see one of those statues come down. And I expect that the DC one is probably not far behind. They've been trying to get that one down for a long time too.
Yeah. So Emily, you got any final thoughts on?
I'm just going to echo what Sarah said, and that if Frederick Douglass was angry about it from the very beginning, there's something very, very wrong. And I think the whole story of how that was put together, and sort of it's just a terrible story. So yeah, I think it's well worth being removed.
So Emily, let me stick with you here for a minute and ask, and actually I'm 1 minute from my, actually, you know what? I am going to jump to what was going to be our last question, and then we'll go to the audience questions. And that is that the events of January 6th are still extremely fresh in everybody's mind. Obviously they are, being relived especially over the last couple of days of the impeachment testimony. So how do you think we memorialize an event like the storming of the Capitol, which frankly has its roots in racism? And how does the destruction caused by that event compare to the destruction associated with the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020? I think most of us would argue that is not a moral equivalency, but kind of making the point that property got damaged in both. So how do we compare those two events, and what do we think should happen in terms of creating a memory of what happened at the Capitol? And I'm going to start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with kind of the moral equivalency part of this. And that's, I've certainly seen many arguments and this is one of the things that's so depressing, I think, about our entire discourse right now, which is that there's just so much whataboutism all the time. Like, if you're mad about this, why aren't you mad about that? If this is the same thing as this, when none of these things are the same. That, the property destruction is not, for me, the primary issue. It's that the Capitol attacks were an attack on our very democracy. The events over the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests were, trying to correct hundreds of years of wrong, and pointing to particular objects in our communities that were symbolic of that. And so a lot of the destruction that takes place is symbolic of this much larger problem. And, I think that we were all just so upset with January 6th and, and we're seeing those events being replayed over and over again over the past couple of days as well. So it's all really, really fresh still. I don't know how we're going to memorialize that right now. I think that we're going to have to wait and see, what the next thing is that's going to happen. And I think one of the things that has kind of continued to trouble me too is that, I was very familiar with the art in that building, and seeing, some of that art is deeply violent, and very tied up in some of the worst things about the United States. And some of the juxtapositions that I saw in some of the images continue to trouble me, and I don't think I've come all the way to a conclusion yet. So, I think we're going to have to sort of wait and see how that's all going to play out.
Yeah. Kabria, what do you think?
Yes, I would echo what Sarah said. I do think it's a false equivalent, false equivalency. The Black Lives Matter movement, it's a global movement, and it's really about peacefully protesting state-sanctioned police violence against Black bodies, against Black people. The January 6th storming of the Capitol was really based on, as we know, this big lie that Trump had really won the election and it was being stolen from him. And what I think we witnessed on January 6th was actually a backlash toward Black voters and voters of color who carried Biden to victory. I think it was a backlash to the fact that Black women are the backbone of American democracy, as Kamala Harris said. I think that's what you're seeing on January 6th. It was a white supremacist insurrection. That's just what it was. I mean, we saw the Nazi symbols and all of that. I think in terms of memorializing it or commemorating it, I actually would like to see, a memorial to the fallen officer. I believe his name was Brian Sicknick. I'd like to, first of all, learn exactly what happened that led to, his loss of life. But there were also, police officers and others who were injured in the insurrection. So I would like to know more about that. But I think we can start with memorializing the fallen officer. That might be the way forward. I know with the impeachment hearing, we're talking a lot about accountability. I think there's also something to be said about those narratives that are coming from those who experienced that, that tragedy. We need to hear those narratives, listen to them, not make fun of them, not mock them. This is from like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, who talked about her own experience. Like, we need to listen to what she's saying, and we need to understand the trauma that was caused that day. But that is in no way similar to Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, agree. So we promised we would take some audience questions. So let me try to summarize some of these in our last few minutes. Somebody asked, protesting monuments is not new. How common has it been over the decades to protest Confederate monuments at the times they were erected? So does anybody have a take on that one?
I have a feeling Kabria is going to have some things to say too, but it's always been there.
Okay.
The protests, you just don't hear about them because of where they are. So they're in the Black newspapers, right from the beginning, editorials about this. People like W.E.B. Du Bois knew the story right from the beginning. Frederick Douglass knew the story right from the beginning. There was low-level resistance against these statues, vandalism. The John C. Calhoun statue in South Carolina is a really good example. They had to make a new statue and stick it on a higher pedestal because so many people threw rocks at it. Union veterans complained the entire time. Said that they could not believe that this was happening, that anyone was allowing this. And then, over and over and over again since then, at moments of flare-up of civil rights issues, there have been so many times that it's come up again. The Silent Sam Monument in North Carolina, over and over and over again, people tried to get that taken down. So this has never it's never been a consensus that it was okay. There have always been people trying to raise the alarm and trying to do something about it. It's just that finally now we're collectively listening.
We have a couple of questions about Stone Mountain. What exactly do you do about something that monumental?
Yeah, that's a problem. I think that the first thing you have to do is you have to get the scientists involved. The first thing I would want to know with something that big is, are you going to like further destabilize the mountain or like destroy ecosystems by trying to sandblast that thing off? I mean, putting it up there in the first place was already so much damage to the ecological aspect of it. So I think that would be the first question. There's no way that that's going to be taken down and not create a huge eyesore. So I'm very glad that I'm not going to be on the committee for that.
There you go. And here's somebody asking about, what about monuments or artwork in a privately owned building that are required to be preserved because of, I presume, the building's historical preservation status?
Oh, that's a tough one, because we actually, the Park Service actually has a statement about pre-existing commemorative works, and and says they need to be preserved, even if they are deemed inaccurate or incompatible with prevailing present day values, because I think especially if you're talking indoors, you've got that's a more controlled environment, so you have an ability within the indoor environment to provide interpretation that will contextualize that item or painting or whatever it happens to be, and so the ability to, or so people's ability to kind of turn it into a place of worship is somewhat reduced at that point.
Gotcha.
I think that's the thinking behind this.
This is, I'm going to actually take this as our last question. This is an interesting one because it gets at who gets to decide. So this person asked, I agree in principle that the fate of monuments should be decided by local communities, but what about communities where the loudest voices are racist? Or communities like towns in Vermont that are predominantly white? How can we prioritize and center the perspectives of marginalized people when deciding the fate of these monuments?
I can take a stab at that one. One of the things I just participated in a conversation about commemorating actually, Boston's 250th, and I was one of the things that the organizer did was she asked us to think about who was at the table, who was in the room, and who should be in the room. So even with a group of, if you have a white majority, we can still think about who should be in the room, whose views should be represented, whose perspectives should be taken, right, as you're talking about a particular issue. And so I think that's one way to approach it. And then, as I said before, to sort of center particular ideals like inclusion and belonging. So we've seen that there might be a majority white town or city, and we've seen how that can change. And so would people feel comfortable coming to your town or your city, right, if you have monuments that are racist or in other ways inappropriate? So we want to think about centering some of those values that we hold near and dear as citizens of a particular community. And we also want to think about who's part of these conversations. And if they're not part of it, how can we invite them in and we reach out to them? I think that's one way forward.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll weigh in on that too, because I think I'm the one who proposed the idea of local communities taking over anyway. So I would say my heart is where your question is. that, you know, I know that when I'm saying that local communities need to have control, that one of the things that obviously isn't going to happen is if it's a community where the people who are in control really want the monument to stay there, then they're probably not going to get changed first. But I think that, first of all, trying to do these things from like a legal, like federal fiat is going to be hard. In our environment right now that is so polarized, it's going to be hard. People are going to see it and be really paranoid about it. You know, the Capitol attack, I think, is a real clear sign of where some people are at when it comes to the federal government right now. And so, you know, when you're thinking about trying to make major change about something like all of the monuments in the United States, you've got a couple ways you can do it. And one of them is through legal channels. Obviously, one of them is through extra legal mob action, which is what we saw happening over the summer. But what you need to do is kind of move the needle and change people's minds. And you're not going to change people's minds by doing this by federal fiat. But, you know, hopefully as you start to build a wave, then the wave will eventually reach some of these places. And I think that, you know, I've been seeing that happening this entire 5-year period. Like, I couldn't believe what happened this summer, and that many monuments came down in the middle of the pandemic, that, you know, communities in Alabama, Birmingham and Montgomery and so many communities rebelled against the state government and said, hey, we'll pay your $25,000 fine. We're taking our monuments down. We don't care. Like, that municipalities would rebel against the state governments and take back their land. I never thought I would see that happen. And so I think that the power is going to come from the local, and that we have to kind of support anywhere that good things are happening and trust the process, that hopefully eventually it'll lead to them all coming down.
Yeah, I keep thinking about the phrase that I heard the National Park Service chief historian say in a conference I was in, and he says that, and I'm thinking particularly about anniversary, and we're talking about January 6th, you know, well, 2025 is going to be the 5th anniversary of 2020. You know, how are we going to remember this? And so he said that each anniversary presents our generation with the opportunity to revitalize and rehabilitate the American narrative by deciding how the intangible values we have chosen to share are to be reflected in tangible places and objects we choose to interpret for the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that we're not necessarily doing this for all time. We're doing this for maybe another couple of generations, and then they'll decide how they want to carry it forward.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and that's so important. And I'll just note too that like this all started right after the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. That ended in 2015. And those 4 years, the work that public historians did to make sure that nobody could stand on 2 legs and, you know, support the lost cause anymore, that everybody understood that the war was about slavery, that we could like live through each moment year by year, and kind of, you know, what the New York Times did with like the every single day telling you what happened in the Civil War that day. Like, I gotta think that moved the needle. And that, you know, because I heard everyone, like when people started talking about monuments in 2015, suddenly everyone was using the arguments that historians have been using for the past 4 years. So what we've got to do is we've got to keep doing the work, and keep trusting that our voices and the things that we do and the things that, you know, when we go out and reach out to communities and talk to people, that we're going to change somebody's mind, and that we just have to hope that we keep pushing this forward.
Well, I want to respect our panelists' time and our audience time. Thank you so much, Kabria, Sarah, Emily, for taking the time to join us tonight. And of course, all your prep time leading up to this. Thanks so much to our audience and our Athenaeum community who joined us tonight. I hope we made good on our promise to give you something to think about. I hope you will continue to follow our series over the course of the year. And so I'm going to say thanks so much to Jean Marie and to Carolyn for helping us out tonight. Good night to everybody, and stay healthy, everybody.